And because I was convinced you were going to absolutely fry yourself alive and turn into a French fry. There are other people who have been involved in time travel, Mike, that I've had on the show, and honest to God, Mike, they're gone.
Ever since the dawn of modern times, there have been several interesting concepts that have fascinated us all. And time travel definitely ranks high on that list. As you can imagine, the topic of time travel is one that is very nuanced.
We can definitely travel into the future by moving faster relative to everybody else. And then you'll come back less aged than those you left here on Earth.
I rather like the sound
the
of that.
The tricky part comes if you want to go into the past. And that's really dangerous. It is so dangerous.
Nevertheless, no matter the complexity, there are those who even believe that time travel isn't a possibility, but a reality. But is there really proof of this? Are there people who have indeed traveled in time before? We'll be diving into all of the evidence in this video, so buckle in. Time travel, science fiction or reality? Time travel is a concept that has always been pushed by many as a possibility. Now, for most people, even trying to fathom the possibility of time travel is pretty difficult. However, some in the scientific community have indeed explored the chances that humans could be able to travel back and forward in time. Of course, we all know and understand what time travel is, the phenomenon where someone travels into the past or the future. Ever since it became a mainstream thought, time travel has always been seen as something impossible. And it's understandable why. For most people, the major limitation of time travel is that the technology just isn't available yet. At the same time, those who don't believe in time travel claim that the repercussions of such a thing will be intense. From the consequences of changing an event that happened in the past to the impacts that altering the future could have on the present. Nevertheless, the prospect of traveling in time is attractive for obvious reasons. I mean, think about it. Imagine you were able to travel back to biblical times, or to ancient Rome, or medieval Egypt, to see just how the pyramids of Giza were built. In many ways, time travel would essentially provide the answers to many of the questions we have had about our world and its history. Instead of just thinking about things, we could literally travel back in time and see how our world evolved and became what it is today. At the same time, being able to go into the future will help us answer so many questions. For instance, you could see the consequences of certain actions you're thinking about taking now, then come back into the present and maybe fix your actions to get better outcomes. There is honestly so much that could be done with time travel. And when you start to piece together the many possibilities, you can imagine why so many people are so excited about it. The possibility of traveling in time. For now, we live in a world where the prospect of traveling in time seems pretty out of reach. So far, no one really knows if this technology will ever be developed, and it appears that the only things we have to go by are wishes and hypotheticals. However, there are those who actually believe that time travel can be achieved. One such person is Joe Rogan, the popular comedian, TV personalist, and podcaster. Joe is especially famous for his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. It is currently arguably the most popular podcast in the world, raking in tens of millions of listeners per episode. And on this podcast, Joe has been known to speak on a myriad of topics, everything from politics to scientific studies, and even topics that many might find a bit conspiratorial. As someone who has always been keen on exploring stuff and finding answers to some of humanity's biggest questions. And in an episode of his podcast, he shared insights on why he believes time travel could indeed be a possibility. On this episode, Joe had on fellow comedians Bert Kreischer and Tony Hinchcliffe. And here, the three men spoke about theories of space travel and the true possibilities that lay ahead. The conversation began with the men speaking on Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, a 2022 sci-fi movie about a Chinese immigrant who gets sucked into the multiverse in order to save the sacred timeline. Starring heavyweights like Michelle Yeoh and Ke Huy Quan, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once was a smash hit. The movie even won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and it has become the latest in a long line of blockbuster movies to really dive into time travel and the prospect of moving between time and space. Jumping off the conversation about how awesome the movie was, Joe began explaining that the discovery of time travel could have significant impacts on our reality as we know it, especially as it could basically mean that time will cease to be measured linearly. The theory that Joe espouses here was first put up by Terence McKenna, the popular ethnobotanist and mystic. McKenna was mostly prominent for his advocacy of the responsible use of psychedelic plants. However, he also spoke extensively about a myriad of topics, ranging from philosophy and culture to environmentalism and language. Speaking once about time travel, McKenna explained his theory that time occurs concurrently. So, while we live in a version of reality at the moment, our future selves are already existing and living as well. Essentially, this would mean that if anything related to a time machine were to be made, it would most likely come from the future. Basically, someone with a time machine who comes into the present and gives humanity that information.
That the moment that device were invented, we could call upon the resources of all future human history to bail us out of this mess that we're in. It may be the only way to save the planet. An immediate time wars commitment to spare no effort to send information forward into the future looking for help.
At the same time, McKenna also explained that the advent of time travel would essentially change how we view time as a fabric. Instead of just letting time travel in a straight line, the advent of time travel would essentially mess things up as people would be able to manipulate time as they see fit. And the consequences of such an outcome can't possibly be explained unless they are experienced firsthand. Interestingly, Joe also had a different theory of time travel. When he was asked by Brett about where or when he'd love to go back to if he could access a time machine, Joe explained that it would most likely be impossible to go back to before a time machine is invented. You know, if one ever does get it, is also quite interesting, of course. Generally, the perception of time travel is that a time machine will give you the opportunity to basically go to any point in time and see how people lived. But that in itself might not be the case. How time travel affects reality. When it comes to time travel, one of the biggest questions that experts have been asking is what the impact on time would be if a person were suddenly to travel to the future or the past and change things. Take our present reality, for instance. Everyone knows that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. And following his death, Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, was sworn into office. However, if a person were somehow to travel back in time to that moment and stop the assassination of President Kennedy, then what could that mean for American politics and the future? For some experts, a change in the past would ultimately translate to the future and mess up the timeline. However, there are also those who believe that these changes might not necessarily matter. Basically, the argument for these people is that time is a self-healing fabric that ends up settling by itself. So if, say, someone was to go back in time and stop the assassination of President Kennedy, it doesn't necessarily mean that he would go on to serve his full presidential term. In fact, it doesn't mean that the president wouldn't have died that same day. It's just that instead of being shot at while riding in a motorcade, he might have been poisoned or something. Basically, what's going to happen will happen regardless of what anyone tries to do. Well, Joe Rogan has also weighed in on this topic. In a separate edition of his podcast, Joe had on the popular artist Greg Overton. And here, the two delved into several interesting topics, starting with the impact of next-generation technologies like artificial intelligence and time travel. In the episode, Joe highlighted his belief that the universe itself is God, and that as time changes, the universe evolves in such a way that it becomes even more all-powerful.
Maybe the universe is God, and maybe the way God is created is through intelligent life. That intelligent life creates a far superior version of itself in artificial intelligence, and that creates a far better version of itself infinitely. They just keep making better versions of itself as it has more of an understanding and more capacity, and it grows and it makes better versions of itself. It's eventually going to get to godlike powers. The power to create universes, the power to create solar systems, the power to stop time, reverse time, the power to traverse immense distances instantaneously. It'll just have...
Speaking on the subject of 3D printing, Joe explained that this appears to even be what many alien ships are now being made out of.
I mean... Well, that's what they think the spaceships are made out of now.
Yeah.
Like when Bob Lazar was first examining, if he's telling the truth, when Bob Lazar was first examining the spaceships, the thing that blew him away was there was no seams. It didn't make any sense. Like how could one even make something like this? Well, now that we know, there's 3D printers, and you could make something like that.
Yeah.
You could, I mean, I don't think you could make it that scale yet, but if you had enough of a capability, you had machines that could do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we thought of it,
yeah,
and we're doing it, and they're fucking
right
60 million light years ahead of us.
Right. Like, who's to say they're not? Who's to say they're not 60,000 years ahead of us, or 600,000, or 6 million?
From here, Greg immediately links things to time travel. And he had a rather interesting take on the subject, explaining that time travel could essentially make groundbreaking work even easier for us humans, since we will have access to the
6 million.
Or, like, think about it, if you have a fucking time machine, you could go back to check out some shit that already happened, but you could also go forward. I mean, we just have no comprehension of what you could... Maybe you could, like, start a project in your lab, right? And then travel... And you get all these fucking AI robots to work on it, and then you travel way forward in time and go get it, and then bring it back.
Ooh,
and then
instantly.
It's the fucking ultimate thing.
Ooh.
You know?
Forever.
But what if we don't really understand the nature of time to make those definitions? What if you could get this time machine, what if you could kind of like step out of time in a lot of different ways that you don't think would,
right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right. Like you could go into a timeline and you don't even necessarily affect that timeline.
If you know how to just observe it.
Right.
And not like physically disturb it.
But you do affect it if you go forward in the future. The idea of a time machine, the current idea of a time machine, is that you can't travel where there are no roads. So once a time machine is invented, then everything from that time machine is invented forward becomes a completely different way of using time. Because time now is nonlinear.
Yep.
Time now,
it's
anyone can go. So
thing.
Everything happens all at once.
Yep.
So people from the future will be traveling back to the moment where the first time machine is invented. So everything will change instantly.
That said, there is also the argument for those who travel in time and who don't mess with the timeline. For instance, a person could decide to travel into the future just to see what the world is like. This means that they don't change or alter any events. They basically just act as observers and look through to see how the world works. Does that mean that their actions will affect the timeline? Well, to answer this, it's important to remember that people don't necessarily need to take physical actions to change the timeline. For a perfect illustration, imagine you were to travel forward in time to see what your life would be. You get to the year 2050, and you find that the person you're dating right now isn't the person you end up with, even though you love them so much in the present. Armed with the knowledge of what caused your relationship with your current partner to fall apart, you decide to head back to the present and fix things. By merely doing that, you've basically messed with the timeline. even though you didn't actually take any actions in the future. Instead, you used knowledge of what happens in the future to change something in the present. And as a result, your actions could cause a ripple in time that will affect the future eventually. So if you think about it, there's really no basis to the fact that you have to take a specific action to affect the timeline. Even something as mundane as seeing the outcome of an action in the future and then going back to the present to change your behavior based on this knowledge can completely affect the outcome of things in the future. Then, we should also consider the fact that timelines tend to be interwoven. For instance, let's head back to the JFK example. According to reports, JFK was assassinated by a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, if someone were to go back to that fateful day and prevent JFK from getting shot, what would happen to Oswald? Would he leave the grounds without accomplishing his mission? Would he end up killing someone else? Could he have ended up living a full life? Who knows? Questions like these intrigue a lot of people when it comes to time travel, and it almost seems like until we know a time machine has been made, we won't be able to really grasp the impact that time travel can have on us as a civilization. Mike Markham's time machine attempt. Now, with everything that's been said, you might be wondering, has anyone ever even built a time machine? Do we have this technology available, and is there a way we can work with it? Well, it might surprise you to hear that there have been some people who invented time machines, or, at the very least, claim to have. And among these many claimants, hardly is any as prominent as Mike "Madman" Markham. Born and raised in Stanberry, Missouri, Mike was an amateur inventor and engineer who liked to tinker with stuff and make devices. Interestingly, Mike actually had no formal scientific training. Either his parents were too poor to send him to school, or he just was never the type to focus more on academic prowess. Whatever it was, Mike never really excelled at the conventional education track. Still, what he didn't have in formal education, Mike appeared to more than compensate for in his brilliance. From a very young age, Mike had been building some really cool stuff in his garage. He got old TVs, CD players, and other stuff, pulled them apart, and pretty much just build things with them. As you can imagine, some of these inventions would work, while others would end up just being junk. Anyways, one major project Mike was working on was something called a Jacob's ladder. Basically, this was a device that consisted of two metal rods that started close together at the bottom and moved apart as they went up. Connected to a transformer, Jacob's ladder could essentially generate its own electricity. Now, speaking of the transformer, Mike had to get pretty creative. You see, to get the electricity arc going in the Jacob's ladder, Mike needed a high-voltage power supply. Basically, something that could supply tens of thousands of volts at a time. Considering that he was quite limited in how much power he could produce, Mike had to get creative. And his experiment worked. In his dusty garage, Mike managed to create a transformer that could emit up to 20,000 volts of electricity. Anyways, here's how the Jacob's ladder was supposed to work. Voltage would be applied to the conductor. Then the electrical pressure will go ahead to ionize the air particles between the rods, thus allowing the current to flow. The arc begins at the lowest point of the ladder, where the conductors are closest together. Then, the heat from the arc makes the air around it hotter and reduces its density. Because hot, ionized air has lower resistance, the hot air will rise and the arc will go up along the reactors. Still, there were some issues with the workings of this reactor. For one, the arc won't start on its own, so Mike had to move the rods in order to initialize it. At the same time, the entire device won't work if there's a difference in factors such as the air pressure and humidity. In fact, the presence of things like smoke and excess water in the air could also affect the general operation of the device. To work around this finicky nature, Mike had an idea. He could use lasers to heat the air around the conductors. Doing this would reduce the air resistance, ionize it, and give space for the spark to get ignited on its own. So, Mike took out the laser emitters from a few CD players, connected them to his transformer, and fired the entire thing up. Well, like many people who have successful theories, Mike was shocked to find that this thing didn't work. There was no spark, and it appeared that there was something else wrong with the device setup. As he went to turn off the device, however, Mike realized something else. Just hovering above his device was a sphere filled with distorted air. Unsure of what it was, Mike decided to toss a screw into the energy field he was seeing, only to be shocked when the thing disappeared. Mike was stunned. He didn't know if the screw got vaporized or if something different had happened to it. Then, to make things even more shocking, the screw appeared again a few seconds later. Except, this time, it was a few paces away from him. Several times Mike tried this experiment again, and he got the exact same result. He'd throw the screw into the energy field, it'd disappear, and then reappear out of the field again. As you'd imagine, Mike was really confused here. But he had two theories. Either the device he made was teleporting objects, or it was sending them a few moments into the future and sending them back. He tried the experiment a couple more times, but the machine soon overloaded and shorted out. The machine might have been fried, but Mike knew he was on to something. So, he decided to rebuild his machine. Except that, instead of getting something only a few inches tall, he'd build it to be as large as 8 feet. To do this, though, he'd need a massive energy source to power the entire thing. Everything else he needed to scale up his device was available, but he needed to get his hands on a massive power source that was commensurate. Mike knew there were 6 industrial transformers just sitting in a yard close by, but he wouldn't be able to get them because they belonged to a local power company around.
So, Mike called a couple of friends and got a pickup truck. Together, they drove to the substation where the transformers were, picked up one of them, and drove away. With his power source, Mike began toiling away at the machine. He got fresh components and an even sleeker build for it, plus it was much larger, so it had more power to operate. A few weeks later, Mike's device, albeit a bigger, more powerful version, was finally ready. It was finally time for Mike to test what he had built, and, by extension, test the theories he came up with when he built the OG version. He powered his device, and he heard a loud spark. This was followed by a loud bang, and then nothing. Mike's entire house went dark. He looked outside and found that he had basically caused a blackout across the entire town. Seemingly unbothered, Mike went back to his machine to tweak it a bit. After a few tries, he was finally able to get the device working without causing brownouts all over town. And this time, the device worked. The first thing the device did was to open a massive vortex. So, Mike immediately went to work, throwing objects at it. This time, though, there was a difference. Instead of reappearing a few moments later, the objects never came back. A few days later, Mike invited some of his friends over to come mess around with the vortex. They threw random stuff in, including his own couch, and as he said, the items never returned. Then, all of a sudden, the guys heard a knock on Mike's front door. When they opened the door, they saw a few police officers. Apparently, some of Mike's neighbors had noticed the strange activities going on around his house and reported them to the police. This, as well as the fact that the local power company had reported the missing equipment, gave the officers enough of a lead to know that something was up at Mike's place. For everything he had done, Mike was sent to 60 days in jail. He also lost his job and his house, and he was pretty much a pariah in his community. However, Mike had also become something of a celebrity. In fact, his daring acts with the local electricity grid actually made the news.
A Missouri worker set out to make a time machine on his back porch. The contraption he came up with was not completely off the mark, according to scientists. There are theoretical physicists working on those areas, and it's not total nonsense, according to the chairman at the physics department at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. The Stanberry police say the voltage that Markham had diverted into the contraption caused power interruptions in and around the northwest Missouri town of about 1300. Markham was arrested January 29th on a felony charge of stealing the transformers from a power generating station in King City. He pleaded guilty and last month was placed on 5 years probation. Police said the transformers had a capacity of 12 to 76,000 volts each, enough to easily cause electrocution or an explosion. Markham, who told police that he has 2 years of college-level electrical engineering, said he was building a time machine, but didn't have enough power for it. That's according to the Stanberry Police Chief Tom Hampton.
Eventually, Mark's story reached Art Bell, the popular author and broadcaster who was the original host of the paranormal-themed radio program Coast to Coast AM.
I set out to find young Mr. Markham, and I found him. Michael, are you there?
Yeah.
Good.
In an interview that spanned about 90 minutes, Art allowed Mike to speak extensively about his project and what he was hoping to achieve. And, as Art eventually came to see, Mike definitely knew his stuff. The interview reached millions of people, and soon enough, Mike was inundated with calls. Some people offered to send him money, while others even offered to donate stuff like equipment and components to help him get his time machine off the ground. With his newfound fame, Mike also managed to connect with a few experts and researchers. Physicists offered an idea for a mechanism with rotating magnets that would improve control of the machine. After about a year, Mike managed to build a newer, larger, and more sophisticated version of his time machine. So, what became of this whole project? Well, a few years after the first interview, Mike actually fell off the radar. No one knew where he was, and a lot of people even believed he was dead. However, after a lot of searching, Art Bell actually managed to get a hold of him again, and he was finally able to speak about what he had been up to. Thanks to the help he had gotten, Mike had been able to greatly improve the design of his time machine. And in fact, he managed to build what he called a plasma tornado.
Maybe it'll be more efficient if I use, instead of using basically heat from a laser in a cold room, the differential, the temperature difference between those two to stir the plasma, maybe even more efficient if I use the magnetic field to stir it. That's what I ended up doing.
Use the magnetic field to do what?
Basically, it's, well, in simple terms, this thing looks like basically a plasma tornado.
Mike continued with the tests, and he had great success. Then, he decided to test the device on himself. He stood in front of it, took a deep breath, and jumped into the vortex. Just like that, Mike disappeared. When he woke up, he saw himself in an open field in Fairfield, Ohio, about 800 miles east of his warehouse in Kansas. With no memory of who he was or any resources, Mike went to a homeless shelter to get some food. There, he looked at a newspaper headline and realized that he was 2 years in the future. Mike had done it. His memories had begun to return as well, and after a while, he saved up enough money to head back to his warehouse. But when he got there, he was shocked to find that the entire place was empty. Mike managed to get in touch with Art Bell once more, and this time, he spoke about the updates he had and the fact that he was looking to begin work on a different machine. Once again, volunteers and potential sponsors came along. After a while, Mike managed to build his time machine again, and this time, he decided to travel in a metal tube, which, as he put it, would act as a Faraday cage and protect him from any side effects. He went into the vortex that he had created, but that was it. No one ever heard from Mike again. Despite the number of times people tried, no one could reach Mike. However, while he might no longer be found, Mike's legacy remains, and for those who care to know, he will forever be a legend. The prospect of time travel is a very exciting one, and if we're to go by the guests on Joe Rogan's show and the story of Mike Markham, this seemingly impossible dream could end up becoming a reality. But what do you think? Could we get to a point when humans can travel in time? Let us know in the comments.